Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the podcast festival Listen Up, organized by the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria. It's very nice to have you again for the second year around. Last year, we organized Bulgaria's first podcast festival, and we were fortunate enough to welcome speakers from all over the world. We have Vlad Nasser from Radio Lab and Gregory Warner from Rough Translation. So after the success of the first podcast festival, we decided this time for a second edition. And this year again, we've prepared 3 days of celebration of podcasting and audio storytelling. The festival is made possible with the kind support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and America for Bulgaria Foundation. And before we continue and I introduce to you our first speaker today, some housekeeping tips. We'll start, I'll be your moderator tonight. And we'll start with some questions to our guest speaker, but after that, you'll have a chance to ask your own questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A section of this webinar, even while we're talking with Asthaa. And for those of you who need translation, in Bulgarian, please select the globe icon to the right hand side of your screen. And without further ado, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Asthaa Chaturvedi. She's one of the producers on The Daily, the New York Times news podcast, and I don't think I'll be exaggerating if I say that is probably the most popular news podcast in the world, because after its raging success, a lot of American and European media, both new and traditional, decided to launch their own news podcasts as well. Prior to joining the team of the New York Times, Asthaa has worked as producer and has extensive experience in other radio and podcast programs as WNYC's On the Media. She was also part of the team of Gimlet, etc. And since she joined The Daily, she worked on a vast range of topics about the future of the Democratic Party in the US, covering the elections, some investigations that probably we'll mention during our conversations today. So Asthaa, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. That's such a kind introduction, Mariana. I appreciate it.
Well, we're very happy to have you. Let's start. I mean, I'm sure it's not just me, but everybody is curious. What happened behind the scenes of The Daily? Could you tell us a little bit how an episode of The Daily is made and kind of bring us in the kitchen?
Sure, absolutely. Well, let's say so we're a daily podcast. We have to make a show every single day. And a lot of days we don't know what the next day's show is going to be. Sometimes that's due to the news cycle and sometimes that's due to scheduling. So we start our days with a member of the team attending the Times' 9 a.m., what's called the Page 1 A1 meeting. That's the meeting where top editors from different desks are talking about what's their main story of the day and what they'd want to see on A1. And that helps inform how we think about what the burning question for us is and kind of what's the most urgent issue that needs to be explained to listeners. We as a team meet at 10 a.m. Producers, editors come with ideas. We think about, okay, this is what the paper is going for. Okay, what do we as the audio team need to go for? And, what does the Daily need to be focusing on? We decide. There's often a robust debate around this. It's, especially I think in the era post Donald Trump, his presidency, it's not always obvious what the next day's story needs to be. So there's a robust debate. We decide, then a team is assigned to just go pursue that story. So we do a pre-interview with the reporter or with the source, who's kind of the main voice of the story, the expert. We get a sense of the story structure, and we write out a script with the host or the many hosts that are also subbing in these days. So, Michael or Sabrina or Kevin or Ested, for those of you who are daily listeners, you'll know these names. They'll come in and be writing kind of, thinking about structure, thinking about how should this interview and this conversation unfold. And that's a very purposeful process. It's actually pretty unique and different from any other team that I've worked on. And we're all kind of in a Google Doc, and we're mind melding and editing each other's sentences, and it's pretty crazy, I think, for people who come onto the team, initially. And that might take an hour and a half, couple of hours. For very intense episodes, it can be days. Scripting is a crazy process. And then we tape as in we record with the source or the reporter, and it's mostly a reporter from the newsroom. And that'll take 2 hours. And then comes post-production. You've only done half the process, that means. Then the producers kind of get in there, they take that interview, and we need to make it 20 minutes or 25 minutes. That process can take a few hours, and it's a few rounds of editing from our editors. In podcast production, especially on the daily, editing means that editors are story editors. So producers are in the tape, and they're kind of we use Pro Tools on our team to edit the show, and editors are thinking about story structure, beats, obvious, the fact checking, standards, ethics, all of that. And that'll go on until, best case scenario, 10 p.m. midnight. Sometimes there was a time when we were often closing the show. We call it closing, publishing the show and handing it over to our esteemed engineer. We have one main engineer who does the daily, and his name is Christopher Wood, and he is in the UK. So because of the time difference, it helps us. So we hand it over to Chris, and we were, in 2020, I think we were often closing the show at 3 a.m. Eastern, 5 a.m. Eastern. And then Chris had to engineer it in like 3 hours, because we do not and cannot miss the 6 a.m. deadline, the 6 a.m. Eastern deadline. So that's how the show gets made. I think
I must say that's quite a long working day.
Yeah. If it feels like a marathon, it's endless. For the one day, it's like, oh God, when is this going to end?
Thankfully, you have reporters all over the world, so the time difference with the UK plays to your favor in this case.
Yes, it does. Yes.
But one thing that you can trust is that at 6 a.m., New York time, you have the daily, basically, in your podcast platform. So, that sounds a little bit like chaotic, even brainstorming process and working process. Could you tell us a little bit about the team, how many people you are, and what are like the task division, and a little bit about your role?
Yeah, so the daily is comprised of, there's a lot of staff, I should say, before I even get started on the people that are like really making the show. It's impossible at the times to make, to do anything with that. You have audience editors and people who are supporting so that the website goes up, and people who are fact checking, and people who are handling the technical stuff. So that's a massive part of the audio team in general. But the daily, I believe, is like 20 to 25 producers. Then we have, I want to say maybe like 7 editors, 7 to 10 editors, maybe less, probably less actually, probably 7 editors, something like that. So 7 editors, 20 to 25 producers. And I'm saying that there's some shift because sometimes people work on different things that aren't the daily. The Times is a pretty robust audio team. And then of course we have Michael and sometimes another host. So typically there's 2 hosts working at the same time this year. So that's a pretty big team. And my role is I'm a producer. So my job is to pitch stories. I'm thinking about the editorial work, like literally what should the story be and how should it sound and how should it be structured. I'm also supposed to be thinking about technical stuff and thinking about literal production, like how do I get the tape? What do I need to do to make it become an episode, in Pro Tools and in the post-production? And sometimes I'm going out in the field, especially in COVID. That means it doesn't really happen that much, but it's nice when you do get to go out. And yeah, so I'm handling like the logistics too. Editors are thinking at the high level, like the best case scenario is your editors kind of just, they're not as engrossed in it, and they can be providing you with everything you need to get over the roadblocks. They can be helping the story move along and become the best version of itself. And of course, it's also, they help us make really difficult calls, whether it's a standards issue, an ethics issue, a kind of like just any difficult reporting issue that might come up, that kind of thing. And an editor can help with that. And they're, of course, management stuff. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier that scripting the questions and the structure of the interview is different from anything you've seen. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the daily is very collaborative. It's not unusual. In fact, it is unusual for any episode to be scripted with just one or two people. That's not what happens. I mean, typically teams, this was not the case in the early days. In the early days, the daily did start with just 3 producers, maybe 2 it was Lisa Tobin was editing. We had 2 people producing, and then it became 3 slowly, and then the team has grown in the last 2 years significantly. But now teams are, my current project, it's like 3 producers and actually 2 editors. And yeah, I think most episodes have 3 producers. And I'm sorry, what was your question? Oh, how is it different? How is scripting different? So the collaborative nature of it, the fact that there's so many people, and I think that we're doing it together, and that it's so well thought out. It's so detailed. We know exactly what turn. We remain flexible as the interview is going, and we remain flexible for reporting changes in the story. But especially on a tight turn, we have really laid out, especially if your pre-interview goes really well, right? Especially if the story is really obviously narrative and the print story is really clear and the reporter knows what the turns are, you can really have a detailed script that allows you to unfold and allows a story to unfold in a way that hooks the listener in. And that is what feels so unusual. Typically scripts that I've written, I mean, I don't think most shows need such detail, or they choose not to go that direction. And also they're often solo projects, and then your editor will come in and then the host will come in. That's not the typical case for the daily.
Well, that's quite fascinating to know, because of course, as a listener, the conversation flows, everything seems very natural, but now I know that actually it takes a lot of effort and steps to kind of lead to this kind of conversation that tells you the whole story. You don't have to be an expert in any of the topics you cover, from let's say the conflict in the Middle East to I don't know, the pandemic, or what's happening at the border between Poland and Belarus, and the refugee crisis there, etc. But it's so well explained that after listening to an episode, you kind of feel that you know the topic much better. How do you? You mentioned already a bit on that, but how do you choose? There are so many stories that the New York Times covers, and there are reporters from each and every hot spot in the world. So how do you choose which topic to become an episode of the Daily?
So true. You know, is it urgent? Is it answering? Is the episode going to help us answer a burning question? You know, is there, sometimes we ask, is there plot? You know, is there a sense of movement and something unexpected in this story? Sometimes we don't do episodes when we feel that you know, the answer is expected. The plot line, you know, we know why this thing is happening in the world. If there is something unexpected in the reason for the latest news development, we definitely that's a major factor. You know, I think, does it merit 25 minutes is a big thing. Why? Sometimes the explanation for something, and that has a lot to do with the unexpected part of it. You know, the way that you make an episode that's a documentary style type thing, or even a 25-minute explainer, you know, on what the latest is with the pandemic or the economy. There needs to be, you know, sometimes an answer is as simple as, well, that's a 5-minute thing. You know, we know why that. We know why. You know, there was a point when the audience needed to understand how the U.S. economy, for example, and really it hit the entire globe, but the pandemic was impacting the economy in the spring of last year, and obviously that had a lot of negative impacts, and people needed subsidies from the government, and they needed assistance. But by the winter time, that answer, we kind of knew the answer, and you know, things had shifted. So it's like the episode changes, or you choose not to pursue it, you know? So yeah, those are some of the questions that, you know, our editors are constantly asking us as producers, and that are being posed in the daily morning meeting. Yeah.
So do you usually work on several topics or episodes at the same time, or how does it work?
Typically you can be involved in a couple, like there's a couple that, you know, you can express your interest in. It's really hard when you're in deep production to have your brain in more than a couple of things, to be honest. So right now, for example, I'm working on an episode that's supposed to come out very soon, and I don't really have the brain space for my following story, you know, another story I'm interested in, until I finish this one. It just needs to be finished, and I need to put in that concentrated effort. But, you know, I call it kind of the exploratory phase, the phase where sometimes things are kind of chill, and you can pitch and brainstorm and be thinking about what's the next story that I'm interested in. That phase is really fun. If it lasts for exactly the right period of time, then you can have a couple of stories in your head. And yeah.
Yeah, and then you move to the deadline crunch.
And then you move to the deadline, exactly.
Where
yes,
you have to
you know it.
Run against the time and the clock. And you mentioned already some of the phases and challenges, but what is, according to you, like the most challenging part of your job as a producer?
The most challenging part of my job. I think structuring a daily episode can be pretty hard. And it's not, like some episodes are easy, because it's just like super straight news or something, and it's just the next day's turn. But sometimes episodes that are a little bit more involved and complicated, and, you know, like an investigation or some kind of feature, which are also really typical daily episodes too. You know, I think we do those, and I'm not speaking for myself here, I'm speaking for my colleagues. I think folks on the team have done really wonderful jobs with episodes that are step backs and that are kind of histories, or that are deep dives with one character on some issue. And sometimes those can be tricky to structure. So I think that might be one of the hardest things about what we do. And you know, of course, the time crunch, like what you think is possible in 24 hours, you know, or that's also, I'd probably just put number 2 on the list.
Yeah, you have to be ready by 6 a.m. That's the deadline.
Yes, yeah, no matter what, that's the deadline.
No matter what, exactly. Well, what you're describing, the production process, actually reminds me, I'm a journalist myself, so it reminds me of the reporting process in general, and like especially when you're covering breaking news. But of course, this is a different process, as you just explained. So actually, could you tell us a little bit more about, so you work mostly with print journalists who have no previous experience with audio storytelling. So how do you transform this written text that is already published in the paper or in the website into this amazing, conversation that, people from around the world can learn from?
Really, we do it by trying to identify like scenes and plot. So, you know, we're trying to understand the order of a story. So like sometimes print journalists, they don't necessarily speak in the way that, you know, or they speak, but they haven't written their story in a way that is very intuitive when you're just listening. So, you know, one of the first things you might do is, you know, you just say, start from the very beginning. Like, if I need to understand this current moment, where do I really need to go back to? Sometimes the answer is a year ago, you know, sometimes the answer is 10 years, or, you know, the previous like 150 years. It's a big history, especially because sometimes, unfortunately, with international stories, you need to know a lot of history and you have to kind of cover inflection points. So then you're like, okay, tell me where it started. Then you try to develop a couple of inflection points and shifts where things in a, you know, whether it's a political thing or whatever, like things shifted, and then you get to your end. So we're often asking for plot, and we're trying to remind the reporter of that. We're asking for scenes. So it's, you know, it's for example, in a speech, we literally, because we're often using tape and we want to hear the tape of a speaker, whether it's like kind of a politician or whoever it is. We want our print reporters to kind of have a sense of what was actually said, you know, and be able to paraphrase a big event. And I think on in-depth stories or stories where we can, there are often a lot of hidden gems in tape that print reporters don't know or recognize as such, you know, as good audio, because, or, you know, they cut something short because it's like you can, and it's print and you just got to get your couple of bites in, you know, in the story. But for us, we need a little bit more room, and we want to build a scene, and we want the top of a conversation, and we want the end of it, you know, we want the footsteps out of a room with a victim of some XYZ issue, you know. So best case scenario, we can train, and we have guides, and we have like developed entire kind of pointers for the print journalists at the New York Times. Other times we just do what we can with their tape, and we tell them, you know, this is what we're going to use. This is actually what you got, and you know, you might not have even recognized what was useful in your tape, but just so you know, this is what we'll be using in the conversation. So yeah, And sometimes getting print journalists to tape their conversations in the first place is a big win for us, because that doesn't happen all the time. So when we do get that, yeah.
And speaking of tape, as you mentioned, you probably record sometimes hours and hours of audio, especially when you're working in the field. So what constitutes a good tape in the ear of an audio producer?
Yeah. The first thing is the emotional kind of texture and nature of the tape. Is there something interesting, just inherently interesting about what's being said, of course. Then a thing that I think that print reporters wouldn't think to get, but that is nice, is like scenes and like interactions between people. So, if you're doing a story about a police officer, it's nice just to get the interview with the police officer, but best case scenario, the reporters have gone out and followed the police officer as he or she is out on the street, talking to people, interacting with their colleagues, in the patrol car. We want those sounds. So that constitutes good tape, one thing that we often say is show, don't tell. So it's really nice in audio to be able to hear, for example, someone's upset or someone's feeling unsure about something. Well, is it nice? Can you get them to say that or some version of that, and actually just say, say this is how this issue made me feel, or talk to someone else in which their tone is very upset. Like, that's better than saying, oh, this person was upset, so that's what constitutes good tape.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned those interactions between, let's say, a reporter and a source, because usually in print, that's the first thing, of course, you lose. Nobody cares about interaction. You just need a good quote, but for audio, it paints a different picture, a different scene, as you said.
Completely.
Yeah, and it's a different vehicle for to tell the story. So you've worked, as we mentioned, on a number of different topics, from politics to investigations as the widespread use of antipsychotic drugs in American nursing homes. And just this week, actually, you produced a piece about the farmers' protest in India. What is the most memorable episode that you've worked on, or a topic in general for the daily so far?
The ones that you mentioned are topics that I'm all kind of I'm very drawn to kind of hard-hitting stuff naturally. I don't know why. I think maybe I just have this, I don't know why I put myself through that, but I enjoy that kind of, politics episode, or sometimes an international story, stories about extremism. But the episode that I think for me is perhaps most meaningful in my time so far is one that we called A Year in Good News, which was an episode at the end of 2020. I think it was one of our final episodes, in which we, after a very difficult and painful year, at the end of a very difficult and painful year, we asked our listeners to share just kind of a voice memo in which they told us about the good news that happened to them, or that they, something good in their year. And I found it just to be so lovely and just so fun to work on. And listeners just shared all kinds of beautiful, touching, sad and funny and lovely stories about their lives and unexpected things. A grandfather riding, hundreds of miles in one year, somebody just knitting a sweater, somebody talking about how they were finally learned how to poach an egg, other people talking about falling in love and having babies, and, all that kind of stuff. it was just so fun to make. It was just really fun to make that episode. And yeah, it was just audio that just this, it was crazy to have to sift through. We are such a popular show. I didn't even realize. I think we got it felt like thousands of emails. Yeah. So that was one of the most special episodes for me.
Yeah, that was a lot of tape to listen to. But yeah, I remember that episode actually. I think at the end of the devastating year that 2020 was for the world, I think each of us kind of needed that feel-good story. Yeah. And it's just like, it was just, as you said, sometimes very simple personal things, but like one after another, those stories were really moving. Talking about moving stories, it's also that the fact that you have like millions of listeners around the world. You joined the show recently, but for you, I mean, prior you were a listener, now you're a producer. What is the secret behind the Daily's raging success? I mean, who would have thought maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago that a news podcast will be so successful? So what do you think the success comes from?
What is the reason behind it? I think it's because we tell a story. I think that because we really place emphasis on how do you make something the most compelling and interesting version that it can be. I don't know. I have a deeply held belief, and I believe that a lot of people on the team feel this way, which is that, as someone who does really value the public service element of journalism, I don't think any of it matters unless people listen, watch, read what we are reporting as journalists. And the only way to get them to do that is to tell a story in a really compelling way. And so that is, in my mind, like what we do, and we place a lot of emphasis on that, and we don't do that in place of the facts and in place of what is going on. But I do think narrative helps draw listeners in, and we balance, I think, the kind of the art of audio with the journalism. Like, I think we, on our best days, we do that really well. And we're, on our best days, we're also answering like the kind of most urgent or pressing question as well.
I mean, as you mentioned, you work on a tight deadline, and it actually involves a lot of intense reporting and fact checking, but along the way there are probably a lot of dilemmas, and you mentioned ethics and verifying information, etc. Do you remember, could you give us an example of a situation where you had to make like a hard decision and on a tight deadline?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to think of something.
And while you're thinking, just to remind the participants in Zoom and those watching us on social media to ask their questions. For the participants in Zoom, please use the Q&A section.
God, what's like a hard reporting call? Ethical.
We can come back to.
Yeah, I can't think of. I think I'm trying to. It's like we do them every day, and I'm sure probably I'm in the middle of one. But to be honest, we had a lot of time to think about it, So it doesn't really constitute like being on a hard deadline and having to make a call for the story that I'm currently working on. I mean, sometimes it's about whether or not to use tape, you know, is something too emotional, too personal? We've also made decisions about names. You know, I know that like the show has had to make decisions about, okay, you know, and I know actually this is not necessarily my story, but I know that there was a producer who was working on an episode with about a woman in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over, and she produced that episode probably within 48 hours, which is a very quick turn. And you know, this person said, I think probably said that like I can't be on your show because of the dangerous reasons, and you know, because of my situation with my real name. And so, you know, we don't use actors, and we basically only use abbreviations, and we don't, you know, the call was made that we're not going to use her name. So that's a recent one. Sorry, that one took me some time to figure out, but
no, of course.
yeah,
I can relate, because sometimes it's a fast unfolding situation and you're making the zillion choices, but then once the story is over, you have to move to the other one and to the next one. Then you kind of forget what happened the day before in such a fast-paced newsroom. We actually have some questions from the audience, so I will ask those.
sure.
So we have a question about, so as we mentioned, the topics you cover oftentimes are sensitive. Is there an editorial decision to try to avoid the liberal bias that conservatives say the Time has sometimes, even in the podcast?
Is there a decision to avoid it? I mean, you know, it's hard to be like, oh, I don't know. I don't know that I agree with the conservative thinking that we have a liberal bias. You know, I know that that's obviously out there. We definitely make decisions, and editors and producers, everybody on the show is thinking about how to have fair and accurate coverage across political spectrums. I mean, and we're really most successfully able to do this when it comes to domestic coverage. I'm actually sure when we talk about international stories, it's much more difficult. So yeah, we get pushback. We talk to each other about that pushback for sure. And I think the one way that the show does that is that we talk to voters and we talk to politicians and different kinds of stakeholders, especially like we do that on the show, you know, so we humanize people, and we don't just, you know, you don't just hear little clips of a Trump supporter. The one thing that the show does is that we talk to voters where they're at, and we spend a few minutes with them. So I don't think that the Daily's ever just, you've never heard from someone and been like, not never, but I don't know for sure, but I think what we avoid is stereotypes or just short little profiles. What we want is a lengthier, you spend time with someone and you get to know, well, why are you anti-abortion, or why are you on the fence between Trump and Biden after so many years of having voted for the Democrats, for example? You know, why is a Pennsylvania union person now interested in Trump? You know, we spent time in the field with people across the political spectrum, for example, ahead of the 2020 election. So that's one way that we try to get out of the bias, or under the perception that the New York Times is biased in any direction.
Yeah, I remember during the election campaign, you actually spent time in like swing states. There were several episodes
Right.
of that, or like talking to people who, as you mentioned, either changed sides or used to vote Democratic and then turn into Trump supporters, etc. And now with the pandemic, what I remember as a listener that you devoted a whole episode actually about people who are hesitant to get vaccinated and
Yeah.
to hear their thoughts on why and what are their fears, etc. So yeah,
It's about
just
understanding completely. Yeah. I know. I remember I
as
produced
an
that
avid
episode.
listener, I just wanted
Yeah.
to chime in.
No, that's super helpful. It's like, right. I made that episode.
There you go. um, um, well, actually, speaking of the pandemic, we have a question how the current global health crisis changed the way the daily is produced.
I have some understanding, and I technically joined the team once the pandemic was well underway across the world, or well under spreading. So everybody was in lockdown. So I know that people were going out into the field earlier. We had a lot of different studios. We have beautiful facilities at the Times over the years. The Times has invested in a really, I think, technically savvy operation for recording our various podcasts. And that came to an end. And we went from being super technically savvy to hanging out on Google Meet and having reporters record their end, their clean end. We like to call it the clean end of their conversation on their phones. So they're talking to Michael and all the producers via Google Hangout, just as we are right now. And for cutting purposes, because you want the clean audio from Michael and from the reporter, I would say 99% of our episodes in the last year and a half have been recorded like this, like you and I are talking right now, and the reporter's on the phone. So that's a major thing. And other than that, I think a lot of training and a lot of editing and quick decision-making obviously happened in person. And that has been something that we're missing on the team, is that, we're missing that kind of in-person urgency and creativity. But I'm really proud of what we've also done as a team during the pandemic too. I think almost every news organization kind of rose to the moment and made it work,
Yeah, thank you. We have a question about the most popular episodes of the daily, but I guess that will be hard for you to say, but maybe your personal favorite episode, or like top 3 of those, or the average listens maybe per episode.
Sorry. What is the question? Oh, like what is the most popular question or popular episode? Is that the question?
Yeah. Like
I don't actually know the answer. Yeah, I'm not sure. I imagine that there is a big bump, like after a massive news event, that people do go to the daily, especially if we're able to cover that news event, like impeachment episodes and stuff. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's hard to say. And just about listeners, as far as I know, on average, around 2 million people tune in for each episode.
Yeah. Let me actually, I think I actually asked someone I'm actually just going to look it up really quickly because I got some information about that. The daily was downloaded 1.2 billion times last year alone.
Wow.
And it has been downloaded 3.2 billion times since its launch in 2017. And I was given this information in mid-November. So that's what I can share.
Okay, the figures speak for themselves.
I That's somebody else's job, but yeah.
It's a dizzying number, I'll say, actually. Well, let me check the Q&A section. I mean, there is a technical question about, do you use different databases and things like that? I assume, yeah, you produce your own audio, or you don't have to, given the resources and the size of the team.
Databases for music, for clips,
or archives, yeah,
for archival
clips,
tape,
research, etc.
I don't know. Do we have stuff that we pay for? Oh, we might have just started paying for like the Associated Press's something. I'm not sure. I haven't used it yet. I know we use Internet Archive. We use a lot of stuff that just like anybody has access to. You know, sometimes finding hard to find archival clips is just a journey that, whether you're working at the Times or whether you're a freelancer on your own, it's the same. You know, it's really mining Google and YouTube and going to, I think, something called internetarchive.org. You can search for keywords and get like cable news, which is really important for us. I'm not sure how well it works internationally. So we use a lot of free tools, and then when something is very important, I'm sure the Times will pay for it. If that's from, one of the, if it's an old NBC clip from the 1970s or something and we can't find it and we know that they have it, I'm sure that our team would pay for that.
Yeah, I guess that's the luxury of working in an
institution.
In a big team, yeah, in an institution, yeah. Well, I just wanted to go back to the start of your career, for example. So again, before joining the Daily team, you work on several other podcasts. What attracted you to audio storytelling and production in general?
What attracted me? I think I just like working with tape and interviewing people more than I like writing. Like I like doing that kind of work more. So that was a big draw. And now, I love that I get to work with music and stuff too, like things that I didn't expect to be big part of my career. Like, I'm not even sure that I'm very good at it, but it's fun to be scoring episodes of the Daily sometimes. So there's that. There's kind of like this artistic element, and then yeah, it's like I also just kind of I don't have to be an expert, like there are beats and areas where I do have a deep level of understanding. But often when I'm talking to someone or when I'm just trying to make an episode happen, I can just kind of be like a fifth grader, and I can just be like, can you just explain this to me so that, a smart 11-year-old could get this story? And I love that part of my job, that I can just be a little bit curious. And I have worked in video as well and in documentary filmmaking, and the barrier to entry is harder with that. Obviously the equipment is more expensive, and just the number of things that you have to have in your brain. What's the shot list and where does the camera need to be? And, what's the lighting on the camera? It's like that it's just a lot more stuff that you have to worry about. So.
All right. And well, speaking about the production, we have a question of the average number of days that goes into producing one episode. And especially given that tomorrow, sometimes you don't know what the big news is going to be, or if there's breaking news, etc. And how many episodes of the Daily are in production right now, for example?
Sorry, An average episode probably takes like 2 to 3 days. We're often just making episodes in 2 days, and we wish we were doing them in less, or sometimes it's 1 day. And but it's probably 2 to 3 days. That was the question, right? And then it was also how many episodes are in production right now. I'm not sure exactly, because you also have episodes that are in like kind of exploratory mode, or one episode will start and then stop for a certain period, and then come back into full production mode. So I imagine like 5-6 episodes, maybe 5-6 episodes, but like 2 of them could air in a given week. You know what I mean? It's like the other 3 or the other 4 or something will be like, or more, there'll be more than that on the list. Actually, it's probably more than 5, but like a lot of them will be for their bigger and deeper produced, more deeply produced pieces that'll be for a few weeks out.
Yeah, and I assume when you're working on a more in-depth topic or an investigation, of course, it requires more time and resources and etc.
Yeah, we call those enterprise stories on our team. So those are enterprise stories, and then there's any story that's less than 2 to 3 days or less is called a quick turn.
We touched briefly on the collaboration between the audio producer and the actual reporters, the print journalist. Is it sometimes hard to convince them to appear on the show or to be under the spotlight, or they're happy to oblige? I mean, I've heard stories actually that there's even some competition who is going to be on the daily.
Yeah, 99% of the time we don't have trouble. I think the reporters at the New York Times understand that the daily audience is pretty big. So it's possible that their story will get, in fact, probably likely that their story may get more traction, and kind of more ears on it, larger audience by being on the daily, or versus just in print. There are journalists that don't want to, sometimes are reluctant to collaborate or don't want to. And unless the story is super pressing, and unless there's like no other option, we often we want to work with people who want to work with us. You don't want it to be painful for anybody. So luckily the Times is so big that we can tap different reporters. And it's true, I know that sometimes it's tricky to just choose one reporter and not be able to go with others. I know it is a challenge.
And of course, I assume it depends of what's happening around the world, as you mentioned earlier. We also have a question. I mean, how do you regain your brain power after you finish an episode, or after the show is out? I guess what helps you get inspired again for the next story, for the next pitch, etc.
And the most important thing would be rest, to be honest. It's really important to get some rest. I'm looking forward to getting some of that later this week, I hope. Yeah, I think taking some time off and just reading, chilling, just thinking, shutting your brain off a little bit, and getting that reset, that is vital actually to building a sustainable show and building a show that's new and exciting, and having producers and editors and journalists in the show that can keep doing this week after week, and I'm really lucky and excited about the fact that in 2021 there has been a big push for that on our team.
Yeah, I mean, creative work be very rewarding, but it's also exhausting, and it takes a lot of effort. Does your downtime time include also listening to other podcasts, or once you leave the studio or the episode is out, you just don't want to listen to anything else?
I have to say, right now, my listening habits are very poor, as in there isn't that much, because I'm trying to just not, sometimes I just want to listen to music. You know, sometimes that can be what's inspiring and like what allows me to rejuvenate and also just begin to think creatively about even how I tell my stories. Like it's actually, it can actually inform, you know, some of your next creative process. So yeah, it's pretty bad right now, right? I don't know if I want to admit this, what my listening habits are at the moment. But I'm looking forward to, I think, during the holidays, catching up on a lot of the good work that has been published by my industry colleagues this year.
And that's why we're very grateful that you find the time to join us for this conversation, especially that in the time zone where you are is actually, yeah, it's much later for you. And before we wrap up this conversation, there was a question about what advice would you give to somebody like a student, a young person who want a career path in audio production or to become a producer?
I think I can give advice to someone who might want to pursue audio, but maybe be an audio journalist. You know, so in the journalism realm, I'd probably be the most helpful. And I think my advice would be to just keep an eye out for what sounds like good tape. You know, for what makes a good story, and be asking questions and be constantly thinking about what question could have elicited that interesting piece of tape that I just heard, or how do I dig deeper with the source or the person I'm talking to right now. And being able to do that, I think, really shows a maturity and drive and just sense of story that's really important in our field. So honing that skill. Yeah, I'm just going to stop there for now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure there are a lot of maybe journalism students who are inspired by what they hear on the daily to pursue a career in audio production or podcasting. So Asthaa, thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, as a devoted daily listener myself, I'm looking forward to listening to the next episode that you produced. I know that one is coming pretty soon, so I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, again, thank you so much for being with us today. Special thanks also to our translators Ines Pavlova and Petya Nenova for translating this conversation into Bulgarian. And to our audience, you can join us again tomorrow at the same time, 6 p.m. Sofia time, for a conversation with Isabel Cagnon, who will tell us a little bit more to how to start your own narrative podcast from scratch and what it means to build audio podcast team for one of the biggest Spanish newspapers. Again, thank you very much for joining us and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.